Hello, Barbara.
As everyone just heard, this is being recorded. We'll get to that in a second. Hello, thank you for joining the Jewish News and Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Phoenix in partnership with the Department of Justice's Phoenix office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Phoenix office for a live online presentation on how law enforcement combats extremism and anti-Semitism. The Jewish News is a nonprofit community-owned newspaper based in Scottsdale. The Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Phoenix conducts advocacy, interfaith outreach, and community bridge building on behalf of the Jewish community. The JCRC works to create spaces for the Jewish community to connect to civil society. We couldn't do this without the support of our sponsors, the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Phoenix and the Jewish Federation of Greater Phoenix. Moving on to introductions, I'm Rich Solomon, General Manager of the Jewish News. With me is Shannon Levitt, our Managing Editor, who will be conducting today's interviews after a short presentation.
And I'm Paul Rockauer, Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. Joining us today are Special Agent Dan Johnson, Supervisory Special Agent Kyle Roberts, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Will Voigt. Dan Johnson is a special agent in the Phoenix office of the FBI. Special Agent Johnson investigates criminal civil rights violations, particularly hate crimes and color of law violations across Arizona. Supervisory Special Agent Kyle Roberts began his career with the FBI in 2010, and after the FBI Academy was assigned as a special agent in the New Orleans field office. While in the New Orleans office, he was assigned to work primarily criminal matters in the areas of civil rights, white-collar crime, and public corruption. In 2015, he was transferred to the Phoenix field office and assigned to the Civil Rights and Public Corruption Squad. In 2018, he was promoted to the Supervisory Special Agent in the Civil Rights Unit at the FBI headquarters, where he was responsible for program management of the FBI field office, as well as responding to hate crime critical incidents such as the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting. In 2019, he returned to the Phoenix field office and was assigned as SSA to the Civil Rights and Public Corruption Squad. Will Voigt, who was born and raised in Phoenix, is an assistant United States attorney who works in the National Security Section of the United States Attorney's Office. He prosecutes federal crime involving domestic violent extremism, hate crimes, and civil rights violations, as well as international terrorism. Will has also prosecuted a wide variety of other federal crimes, including murder, public corruption, and drug and human trafficking. Will sits on the Executive Council of the Arizona State Bar's Public Lawyers Section. He is a graduate of the Duke University School of Law.
Just a reminder to our viewers, you can submit questions at any time using Zoom's chat function. Paul and I, along with Public Affairs Specialist Jill McCabe, will be curating the questions that are submitted and passing them along to Shannon to ask. JN staff writer Nicole Raz will also be live tweeting key takeaways from today's event. And now, Paul Rockauer will share a brief report on recent events and the JCRC's role throughout it.
So the genesis of this program came out of a rally we were all dealing with back in mid-April. We had received word some 6 weeks prior that a certain extremist group, whom we will leave nameless, was planning to have a rally at the Arizona Capitol. We believed that this group's main goal was to gain publicity through provocative behavior. They wanted to bait the community and counter-protesters and use images of violence to gain media coverage as a vile form of public diplomacy. So we wanted to use some Jewish brains on this and went about to deny them their goals and the attention that they sought. So we coordinated with our partners in the Jewish community and in different faith and ethnic communities to stand in solidarity against hate in the safest, most effective way possible, by staying away. We didn't want any community organizations to take their bait, so we urged everyone to avoid the counter-protests. Meanwhile, we worked with an expert from ASU's Public Safety Innovation Lab, whose specialty is to advise law enforcement on violence prevention and community safety during public protests as a means to share on best practices. And we partnered with Cure Violence Global, which treats violence and extremism from an epidemiological standpoint, to conduct a webinar to educate local media about how to cover the events without amplifying extremist messages or encouraging broader participation. We were also able to work with the Western State Center, which monitors extremism, to focus on internet chatter around the rally. Throughout the whole period, we were in close contact with our partners in law enforcement. And leading up to the rally, we discussed the need for increased security and police presence around Jewish institutions and synagogues in the community around the period of the rally. When the rally finally happened, thankfully, it passed relatively peacefully and uneventfully. Little more than a dozen of this sorted group came out, and the counter-protest against them was measured. Nothing truly escalated. It ended relatively quietly, with the group departing from Phoenix without achieving their goal of attention or significant coverage. Given how precarious the situation could have been, this really represented quite a victory against hate. Throughout the whole affair, the Jewish community did not face this threat alone. We were supported by a broad coalition of faith and ethnic communities across the valley and by law enforcement who helped keep our community calm, which is definitely no easy feat, and safe from harm. We'd like to specifically thank some real mensches, including Detective Mike Hillman of the Phoenix Police Department, Detective Tom Hughes of DPS, as always Jimmy Wasson at the JCC, and of course our friends at the FBI and DOJ, most specifically Special Agent Dan Johnson, as I say, Kyle Roberts, and U.S. Attorney Will Voigt. The Jewish community has had to face some more uptick of anti-Semitism in the last 2 months, and it hasn't been easy in this period following. But I can say this, is that the Jewish community will get through these difficult times, and we'll do so thanks to our partnerships, coalitions, and the strength of our relationships. So with that, I hand the program over to Special Agent Dan Johnson, Special Supervising Agent Kyle Roberts, and U.S. Attorney Will Voigt. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I want to take a moment to thank everyone here, Rich and the Jewish News, Shannon for taking her time to be the voice of the Jewish News in this matter, Paul and the JCRC for hosting this, and of course, my partner Will and my boss, Kyle, for taking the time to be involved and lend expertise and knowledge to what I know is both a timely issue and one that we all care about. With that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll spend a little bit of time going through a presentation that Will and I have put together. All right. We are going to spend this time talking about hate crimes, talking about the federal laws that codify those hate crimes and give us the tools to both investigate and prosecute them, and really just what a hate crime is, how that is part of and different from other speech and other actions. And I'm going to ask Kyle to go next.
Thanks, Dan. Hey, good morning, afternoon, everybody. So what you're looking at here is really, this is our FBI pyramid. So in general with the FBI, what we do is we rank a lot of our priorities. And you can see our top 8 priorities here for the FBI. If you look closely, you'll see that number 5 is protecting civil rights. So here in the FBI, civil rights, what does that cover? So it covers a couple of things. One is what we're not going to talk about today, which is color of law violations, which primarily includes law enforcement misconduct. Primarily, the most common case that we see is excessive force violations. The other part of civil rights, which we will talk about today, is hate crimes. It's been a continued invested interest for the FBI, specifically over the last several years. Dan Johnson on my squad is our primary point of contact who works tirelessly. And Dan, thank you for all your efforts and what you do for the FBI and civil rights. Lastly, what I'll say is you look at the bottom is rigorous obedience to the Constitution. And that's really just the fact that we all take an oath to protect, our great country. So that's all for that.
And I'll chime in briefly. Again, hello, everyone. I'm Will Voigt. I'm a federal prosecutor. And so at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we don't have quite so fetching a pyramid graphic to show you in terms of our priorities, but we prosecute crimes that involve domestic violent extremism, domestic terrorism, hate crimes, and civil rights, among many other federal statutes. But that is prosecuted generally under the rubric of our national security section and part of it in a civil rights section as well. And I have cases in both of those. And for us, this is the number one priority that the U.S. Attorney's Office has, is to combat domestic violence, extremism, and violations of civil rights and violent crimes involving hate crimes. So I wanted to introduce myself and also pass on my appreciation to the JCRC and the Jewish News and to my partners here in the FBI for being able to be here and talk with you today.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Will. We're talking about hate today primarily, and we all know this. Hate makes the news, particularly this current climate. Hate is the kind of thing that everyone cares about. And so it is widely reported, widely discussed, and we read about it. I like to emphasize one particular thing about this, though. We, as the FBI, are charged with collecting statistics about hate crimes from jurisdictions, from police departments, from sheriff's offices all around the nation. That is one of our best measures for how much hate, how many hate crimes are happening every year. But the system in and of itself is flawed. There's no driving force requiring various departments to report hate crimes. There's no consistency between cities and counties for the hate crimes they report. Every year we'll find out about hate crimes that were reported too late, hate crimes that slipped through the cracks of the reporting system. You'll find out yourself this November when we report the next roll-up, the next report on hate crimes in the United States. That's not necessarily a bad news story. It's simply, well, it's simply a fact. And for us, it's a motivation. We know that we get better information about hate crimes when we have better relationships with the communities most likely to be victimized by hate crimes. A primary part of my job is going out and talking to people, giving them information about what a hate crime is so that they can identify it if they're victim to it, if they're witness to it, or if someone else around them is victimized that way. And then giving them a face, not just the FBI, but a face that they can go to and talk about what they know, what they experienced, what their friends experienced. That's one reason we value our relationships with organizations like the JCRC, with people like Paul Rockhour, because no matter how much I try, I'm not going to reach everyone. Paul has an amazing reach across the community. And so there are people who will always feel more comfortable talking to Paul and other communities, people like Paul, than they will feel talking to me. And thankfully, we can still get the information passed that way. And I want to say that while it may be a little counterintuitive, when we find out that more hate crimes are reported, my personal belief is that what we're finding out is that more people are comfortable going to law enforcement with their experiences, reporting the things that have happened to them. Because hate crimes are an intensely personal and emotional thing. I say personal, they affect not just the person, they affect the community that the person represents. And it is hard to go and talk to law enforcement about something that is so emotional and victimizes a person, not just situationally, but because of who they are. And so my hope for this particular presentation today, this back and forth and discussion, is that more people feel comfortable using the contact information at the end of this presentation to contact me, to contact the FBI writ large about what they experience and pointing others to that same information. It does raise the question, though, about just what is a hate crime? And for that, I'm going to ask Will, who has far greater knowledge about the law and the statutes than I do, to explain what is a hate crime.
Sure, thanks, Dan. And I'll take just about 5 minutes. And if you're a lawyer and you want 5 minutes of continuing legal education, this is your opportunity to get it, about what the federal hate crimes laws are. One of the most common questions we get is, what tools does the federal government have and how have they changed over time to combat crimes based on bias motivation. So Dan, you can go to the next slide if you want. Fundamentally, a hate crime is a criminal activity, a violation of a federal criminal statute that is motivated by some form of bias. It's important to note at the outset, the federal government is a government of limited jurisdiction, supreme in its sphere, but in order to pass a law, there has to be an affirmative grant of jurisdiction to Congress in the Constitution. So for instance, you'll often hear about statutes that are based on the Commerce Clause that give authority to regulate activities that affect interstate commerce. The 13th Amendment, which Congress has the authority under to regulate the badges and incidents of slavery, as the Supreme Court has put it, is something that also gives Congress authority to pass hate crime statutes. But the federal statutes that are out there, criminal statutes, are a lot more limited in scope and in number than state and local jurisdictions have, for instance, because those are governments of plenary authority. They can regulate an average trespass in the way the federal government can't. But here are the main statutes that we have available to us in prosecuting hate activities, and I'll just sketch them out, how they went along, how they developed over time. 1968 was really when Congress started to regulate through federal criminal statutes crimes that are based on bias, specifically bias based on race. In the Civil Rights Act of 1968, 18 U.S.C. 245 was passed, which is the first statute on your screen. And this criminalized people who use force or threats of force to interfere with certain types of federally protected activities. Some of those are unconnected to motivation based on race, like interfering with someone's right to vote. But there is a section in there which prohibits using force or threats of force to interfere with activities based on race, color, religion, or national origin. And that includes going to school, engaging in certain types of work activities, serving as a juror, using interstate commerce, using public accommodations like hotels or restaurants and things like that. And along with the right to fair housing statute 3631, which is at the bottom of your screen, which was also passed in 1968. That prohibits using force or threats of force to interfere with housing rights, like selling or occupying a home. Those two statutes together for about 20 years were the main bulk of federal hate crimes statutes that existed. In 1988, Congress passed 18 U.S.C. 247, which is on the middle of your screen, and that prohibits defacing or destroying religious property based upon the religious characteristic of that property. So for instance, painting a swastika on a synagogue or on a church, or destroying a menorah or a nativity scene on church property or something like that. That was prohibited in 1988. It was actually not very effective at that time because it had a very high damage threshold. That was removed in 1996. So that's a statute that was added. The next, and perhaps one of the most important federal criminal statutes that was passed, and the most recent in 2009, was the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act. And that's second from the top, 18 U.S.C. 249. And that removed some of the restrictions in that other statutes are limited by, for instance, federally protected activity restriction. And it prohibits in causing bodily injury or attempting to cause bodily injury using a dangerous weapon if you're motivated by bias against race, color, religion, national origin, like some of the prior statutes. But it also is expanded to include gender identity, sexual orientation, disability. It's a much broader series of bias motivations that are criminalized if you engage in violence against somebody on that basis. Some of them require an interstate commerce nexus, some of them don't. Anti-Semitic crimes, for instance, are something that the government has the authority to regulate under the 13th Amendment, regardless of whether it affects interstate commerce. So that's sort of the most recent federal hate crime statute that was passed. The last one that's on this slide here, which isn't really explicitly a hate crime statute, but it is something that the federal government can use, is 18 USC 875C, and this is making threats in interstate commerce. You don't have to be making those threats because you're motivated by bias. It's not something we have to prove, although, as you can imagine, people who make threats online commonly are motivated by bias. And so that statute is a high bar. It applies only to what's called a true threat, which is a threat when somebody specifically intends to communicate a threat to another person, to injure or kill or kidnap them, or at the very least, a threat that somebody knows is going to be interpreted that way by the victim. And if you use an instrumentality of interstate commerce, like for instance, social media, or if you make an interstate phone call that contains a true threat, then that's something that is criminal. There are also state statutes that apply intrastate sort of communications like that as well. The last thing I would say about that is this is one of the areas where you see the interaction between criminal law and the First Amendment sort of most affect each other. You're of course allowed under the First Amendment to be a bad person, and you're allowed even to say bad things, but you can't make a true threat, which is to say you can't threaten to hurt somebody on that basis. And so the Supreme Court has said that the limit of your First Amendment right is when you threaten somebody. And if you cross that line, then that's something the First Amendment doesn't protect. So those are sort of the statutes that we have available to us federally. It's probably a lot smaller than some people imagine. And that's why we try to work very hard, both the FBI as investigators and the U.S. Attorney's Office as prosecutors, to work with state and local investigative agencies to be sure that we are investigating it as a team, and so that the widest array of potential criminal statutes can be considered if someone engages in bias-motivated criminal activity.
Right. Kyle, is there anything you want to include here?
No, I'll just say, just kind of to wrap up the first couple slides that we've seen, I'll add a couple of things. One, if you go back to the pyramid slide that we were talking about, the only thing I'll add, right, is that the FBI, right, they have a lot of different priorities. We have incidents across the country at all times. The FBI absolutely has the ability to surge resources toward a specific incident at any time, right? So just because a priority may be lower than another one, it really doesn't matter. On any given day, we have the ability to send agents, specialty teams to a critical incident for response. The only thing I'll add to what Will did a great job in explaining the statutes, these are the statutes that are being used. So if you look across the country on the major hate crime incidents that we've had, these are the statutes that are being used. 247 on some of the incidents where we've had active shooters walk into synagogues, they're using 247, 249, and some of these other statutes. So they're very important, and it's a great weapon for us to combat hate crimes.
I agree. And I want to make the point as well that these aren't the only weapon. These are the federal weapons. And we have partnerships on purpose with state and local agencies so that we can address crime as a team. And if a criminal action doesn't fit one of our federal statutes, then we as a group can ensure that, well, the most fitting state statute is applied. Now, this is a team effort, and the three of us here on this webinar aren't the only ones addressing criminal acts. One good example would be if someone comes onto synagogue property uninvited, unallowed, and disrupts activities there on the property. The speech that they use to disrupt the activity might in and of itself be First Amendment protected. But if they're not allowed on the property, then they can be in violation of state and local trespass laws. So that we do everything that we can to take a whole party look at actions and fit the best response to those actions. Will, do you have anything you want to add on to that?
I don't. I think that's a good chance to move to the last slide, which is
Indeed.
some of the opportunities you have to report things. Dan, I'll let you wrap up and then open it up to Shannon for questions.
All right. Well, I'd like to leave this slide up for a moment. This is my email. I'm delighted to receive emails from people who have questions, from people who have concerns, from people who don't know if they should be concerned. I'm happy to make that first communication and then sit down and talk further. If you want to speak on the phone, this phone line rings to our office because I'm not always sitting at my desk. But someone here will make sure that the message gets to me if I'm not available at that moment. And we have an online portal. Of course we do. And online, you can be either as easily identifiable, so that it's easy for me to get back to you and ask you further questions, or you can be completely anonymous about what you want to report to the FBI. I don't think there's a lot of information there, so I don't want to stay here forever.
Dan, let me add one thing for
Please.
the FBI Phoenix for community outreach. You can also go to fbi.gov/Phoenix and look for the outreach tab.
That's a very good point. All right. With that, I suppose I'm going to drop this PowerPoint now. We'll move on to Shannon's questions. All right.
Okay.
Hello, Shannon.
Hello. Thank you guys for that. And that's a lot of information. I'm going to try to get you to illustrate some of that language that's kind of black and white a little bit and bring it into full color for us. But first, I wanted to start with one of our viewers asked the question that this morning there was some news out of the U.S. Attorney General's office. So I guess this might be for Will, but about the direction of like how to pursue, I can't see the question anymore for some reason. Oh, here it is. The strategy to counter domestic terrorism. And Will, I don't know if you saw the information, it's a press conference, if you have any things you can tell us about the new strategy, how effective it will be, what you know, I know you can't say personal opinions, but what it is.
Sure, thanks for that question. You may not believe this, but the Attorney General didn't let me know that we were going to have that press conference the morning of our doing this webinar. So yeah, I woke up to it as well. I wouldn't try to say what he said more specifically than he did, but I think I can say that it has been the department's mission for a long time, and I think it's a good thing that it is re-emphasizing that now to focus on domestic violent extremism as a core problem in our communities, and to focus a lot of resources there. One of the things that is being worked on is to get more resources into investigative and prosecutorial agencies to be able to combat that. So it's a focus we've had for a long time, and I think it's a good thing that we are continuing to focus on that and to make the public aware that there is emphasis, again, in furtherance of what Dan said, to have close relationships with the community, so community members feel safe and that community members feel engaged with law enforcement to report these incidences so we can investigate them and prosecute them where there's a violation of the criminal law.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So I'm kind of going to go round robin here with you guys. And I don't know, sometimes the lawyer question is pretty easy, but sometimes one or more of you will have the best answer, but I'm just going to take a guess. So Kyle, let me start with you. When Paul Rockauer introduced how this idea came into being, he talked of a specific incident that happened in April with a group, and that JCRC's view, along with a lot of other groups, was that they needed to take the air out of their gathering and to, instead of like show up in force and to antagonize them with counter protests, was kind of like to say, no, we don't give you any cameras, we don't give you any media play. And of course, there was media around it in the lead up to the event. But what I want to ask you, is that the kind of thing you want to see? Like an advocacy organization for a minority community like JCRC say, let's like take a step back and not give these guys any air?
Right. So that's really difficult to answer because there's a lot of facts that play into that scenario. But I think it's important to talk about the FBI and their role and what we can and can't do. So this situation comes up a lot. I'll give you an example. A protest, for example. Let's say there is protesters on one side of the street and we have counter protesters on the other side of the street. Okay. One of the protesters walks across the street, rips the snot out of their hand and punches them in the face. Okay. Now, the next day, the person that was punched comes into our office or a local police department and they make a complaint and want to say that their First Amendment rights were violated, right? Let's forget for a second that there was an assault, right? The question is, can two ordinary citizens violate each other's First Amendment rights, right? To ask that question, a lot of times it takes a lawyer in the room or a former police officer to answer that question, right? But the answer is no. And why? Why is because, right, we have protections within the Constitution and the rights are protecting people from the government, right? So it protects people from the FBI, right? It protects people from law enforcement. I only say that in a way to answer your question is the FBI cannot investigate an incident solely based upon First Amendment rights. Right. So in those particular incidents, it's hard for us to get fully involved unless we have a criminal act or believe that an act's going to occur. But it's really hard to answer that question as far as what to recommend. I mean, if everybody would stay their distance apart from one another, right, and mind each other's peace, I think that's probably the best answer. But it really depends.
Right. Well, so in a very antagonistic kind of atmosphere as we have now in the country, do you see more groups or kind of taking this action and advising people not to counter protest? I mean, just like an overview. I mean, are you noticing a trend towards that?
We do see it. It varies across the country. It varies with different groups, and so there's no particular answer I can give you, but we do see it, right?
Okay, good. All right.
Well, Shannon, I'd like to chime in on this as well, if I may. So I talked with Paul repeatedly leading up to those activities. I know that the JCRC didn't make that decision in a vacuum. You know, they worked with Phoenix Police, they worked with DPS to find out what would be really the best response. And that's what we would encourage people to do and organizations to do, activists of all stripes, to work with those law enforcement agencies that are responsible for public safety there, where they are. What we want is safety. And if we can find a way to balance safety and the ability for everyone to express themselves, that's the goal. That's the goal. And we only can reach that goal by having good relationships and open communication. That's one thing that the JCRC is currently modeling.
Okay. Well, let me go to something else, and I'll start with you, Dan, because you talked somewhat about, not a hypothetical, but some of these instances, and also you gave your email address as somebody to contact for this. So last week, or a little over a week ago, there was an incident in Tucson that I'm sure you know about at a Chabad, where there was a swastika and an anti-Semitic slur painted on the door. And that's the kind of thing that makes people, step back and notice and say, what's happening? Should I be afraid? Mm-hmm. So how do you, in your capacity, look at an incident like that? I know you can't say specifics, but that kind of level, like I know that you also talked about once you take it onto a synagogue, you're upping the ante a bit and you've now violated another statute. But what do you do when somebody emails you and says, this morning at my synagogue, there was this?
That is a good question, Shannon. And that is a particularly sensitive point in Tucson right now, because that followed another vandalism, a rock thrown through through a door and a window there at another synagogue. And any time we have an incident like this, the community understandably is frustrated and anxious and feels threatened. And that is understandable. And it's something that we want to address. We want to find a way for the community to feel safe. What do we do as the FBI? The quick and easy answer is that we first and foremost work with our partners. So there in Tucson, we work with Tucson Police. We need to know more, so we partner with them. We aid them in their investigation. We work to gather more information. As I said earlier, we work as a team to find how best these actions can be addressed. And really for that, I'd like to ask Will to help out, because Will can talk about what we really need to show for these actions to be addressed federally instead of state and locally.
Sure. Assuming it's okay with Shannon for me to take that
Yeah,
question.
actually, I do want you to answer that, but I also want to add another wrinkle to that. So Dan brought up the previous week to the Chabad incident was another synagogue had a window thrown through the glass. Now that incident is different, right? I mean, there was no anti-Semitic language. There was obviously vandalism, but since they don't have, as far as I know, they still don't have a suspect. So what do you do with an incident like that? Do you like automatically, because it's kind of coming in the wake of other incidents around the country, do you just, I mean, I know you can't really assume what it is, but what do you do with that? Like here you've got this incident at one synagogue and the other. Like how do you parse those two incidents as a lawyer and dealing with this particular subject?
Sure. I will preface this with the common lawyer answer is that it depends. But that's an extra 2 seconds of CLE for any other lawyers who are watching. No, I would say, not to comment on specifics, but to answer the question generally, it is entirely possible to violate Section 247, which is the religious real property protection, even if there isn't an anti-Semitic word, or even if it's not an anti-Semitic symbol like a swastika that's there. It applies to the destruction of religious property. And there's a lot of case law on what that means. I think there's a case that the church curtains qualified. Certainly, religious imagery would. But if in that case, you're sort of trying to find the suspect, and that's where the FBI is focused. And then you're trying to find out, why did they do this? If they did this because, it's a mentally ill person who's just throwing rocks randomly, we don't have a bias crime there. If it's a neo-Nazi who's doing it because he wants to destroy church or religious property, for instance, then you might have a bias crime there. So I think that the key thing to do is first, at the investigative stage, who did it and what was the reason? And what was the reason often depends on circumstantial evidence, because people don't always say what's in their head as to why they do things. And then finding out what's the right avenue to prosecute if there's a crime there. For instance, whether or not, we can prove that somebody threw a brick through a window because of a bias motivation, you could probably prove somebody went onto land they weren't allowed to go on, in which case you'd have a state law trespass. So those are the types of things that we analyze on an ongoing basis in these investigations.
Okay. Kyle, I want to ask you kind of a follow-up to that question, that the whole atmosphere in Tucson and really across the country right now, there has been reported uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. So obviously the Jewish community is a bit on edge. And at the same time, with the Tucson incidents, you saw that a whole swath of elected officials kind of rallied around in support of the Jewish community. The mayor of Tucson was supportive. The governor of Arizona tweeted about it. Do you think that that is something that the community should look at and say, okay, there are these couple of things that have happened in Arizona, just talking Arizona, but yet the community at large, there are some problems, but we're supported. Like, do you think that should make people feel safer, more at ease, less anxious?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the main things that we want to do is to encourage awareness as well as encourage outreach and feedback to us as well. So coming out, acknowledging that the incident did occur, being transparent about it, and to encourage people to report it is absolutely what's parallel for people like me, Dan, and Will to have knowledge of that incident. So yeah, I absolutely agree. Be supportive of it, and please forward that information to law enforcement.
And well, now I can't ask you specifics, but all right. So when do you think people should worry? Like in the broader sense, like what are the things that you guys are looking for? And Kyle, you can finish. What are the red lines that you're looking for when you guys talk to communities in general? So like for the Jewish community, is there a red line that gets crossed that you think this is something we need to kind of?
Right. Well, the real concern, right? So civil rights crimes are primarily, specifically hate crimes, are reactive in nature, right? We don't know at any given moment when one is going to occur. So it's a real red flag to us, right? A potential concern when the community is reluctant, is scared, or just refuses to contact law enforcement, right? It's almost like the New York motto. If you see something, say something. If people are seeing red flags and signs and they're not telling us about them, it's a concern for us because those are the red flags that's going to be able to give us, right, potentially, Will talked about these statutes that we can get in front of and hopefully prevent a crime before it occurs. And if Dan or Will got anything to add.
Yeah, Shannon, if I could just chime in very briefly, and then actually I would recommend throwing it to Dan because he has a lot of thoughts and practical experiences on this. But from my perspective, I never want the Jewish community or any other community to cross the line from sort of worried and normal recognition of the existence of threats into fear, because as Franklin Roosevelt said, we want a society that is free of fear, and oftentimes extremist groups may not be able to perpetrate acts of violence, and so they have to settle as consolation prizes. We don't want any community ever to live in fear. And I'm going to steal something I heard Dan say once, so forgive me, Dan, but I think it is a common experience that oftentimes a community's fear is made worse or oftentimes generated if they just don't know where to go, if they don't think that there's somebody out there who's working on this and who they can talk to about it. And so that's why we value having conversations like this with the Jewish News and the JCRC, so you know who you can talk to about it, and you can know that there are people out there who are working on it, so that you can be aware and you can be safe, but you never have to be in fear.
Oh, Dan, were you going to say something else? Or I was going to ask my next question to you anyway.
If you don't mind, I'd love to chip in my 2 cents as well.
Please do.
The FBI has done a very good job over the last decades studying the people who commit the most heinous acts and finding out what behavioral conditions were present in them before they acted. And a lot of these things were seen by the people around them. They're seen by those they interacted with, their friends, their spouses, their coworkers, their colleagues, what have you. There is nothing wrong with communicating your anxiety, your concern about a person to me or to my colleagues in the police departments and the sheriff's offices around the state. If something appears threatening, it might be a threat. And we're the ones with our colleagues in the prosecutor's offices who will be in the best place to know. And sometimes something that appears threatening is it is a threat. And we don't know until we go and talk to the person who's making the statements or behaving in a way that's causing people concern. I would love nothing more than to be so busy talking to those people who might pose a threat that all that busy activity means there's no actual no actual crime. Does that make sense? If we can get ahead of the crime by letting people know early that, hey, your activity is concerning. You're not committing a crime, but you should know these people are worried about you. These people you're making uncomfortable, or these people have concerns for you, and let's get you connected to the agencies that can provide you with the tools you need to become more healthy and productive. Now, we'd like to not have hate crimes be an issue. And I'm going to keep coming back to this. Open communication, better relationships, building those trust bridges, even with the people who are causing us concern, I think are a major step towards a solution.
Well, apropos of that, you did say that you had a pretty good relationship with the Greater Phoenix Jewish community, with Paul, with others. Can I ask you if there has been any kind of backsliding in that, in terms of the conspiracy theories have been ramped up? There's less trust in the government and government agencies. Certainly the kind of trustworthiness of the FBI has been called into question publicly by national politicians. And do you feel that kind of some in the media, other places on social media for sure, that kind of conspiracy minded questioning of your motives, and are you listening in on us, and what is your real motivation in quote unquote helping us? Do you feel that in your relationship with the Jewish community, or have you luckily, like, it hasn't happened?
I have had friends and all of the people that I sit down with and have coffee on a regular basis have on occasion asked me if it makes my life harder when the media is talking about the FBI in negative ways. And I think that there's no way for me to truly measure that. But I do know that this is a huge, even a primary part of my job, talking to people, making new connections, and maintaining those connections that I already have. There are people who will always be mistrustful of law enforcement and always mistrustful of the government. The FBI can be a sinister sounding 3-letter acronym, which is why I like to meet people face to face, because I don't look sinister. And it works out. If I can spend some time with someone, especially over and over and over again, well, then not only can I have that relationship with that person, but they know other people who are similarly mistrustful, and they can be a conduit then for those things that the FBI needs to be aware of. And that's our overriding purpose here. For the purpose of civil rights, we need to be aware of potential violations, of hate crimes, of color law violations. We won't be aware of them if people won't talk to us.
Right. Kyle, can I ask you something? In your biography, I think that there was mention that you worked somewhat with the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting victims.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, that's, of course, the greatest nightmare, is that kind of scenario with a mass shooting in a synagogue on the Ina Levine Jewish Community Campus, any kind of Jewish organization here, that when that happened, Jews around the country were definitely on high alert, and this kind of recent uptick puts that back in mind. Can I ask you about that incident, and can you tell us anything about what you saw? Can you break that down for us at all to say, like, this is something that was, obviously it was unusual, it was the biggest anti-Semitic incident in US history, but can you give us some kind of, I don't know, make us feel like a little safer that is not something that is on your radar?
Right.
Or is that something you're always thinking about after having worked with it?
Yeah, no, of course, it is something that the FBI is always thinking about. I can't talk in specifics about that particular case because it's still, it's pending trial right now. What I can tell you a little bit about is kind of the FBI's role in these critical response incidents, if that would be helpful. I was part of the Civil Rights Unit in the FBI headquarters, so I was a headquarters component that went to Pittsburgh for that shooting to assist in the command post operations and some other things. What I can tell you is general what that kind of looks like when that incident happens is there's kind of two components on the investigative side, right? You have the FBI federally and some other federal agencies that are going to be working with the state and local partners within whatever city that is. Right, we've gotten really much better over the last few years, unfortunately, because we've had so many major incidents, right? So we are getting much better with that. On the other component, as far as like on Will's side is, right, the prosecutors are lining up on their side as far as discussions of state or federal prosecution. Lately, in some instances, we've seen both in some of these incidents. The FBI in these cases, right, we can deploy a lot of resources to these scenes. We have our evidence response team that will go out and actually help process the scenes, which it could be entirely a state matter, and we will still send those teams out. We send victim response deployment teams out to help with the victims, to help with their personal items, things like that. So we do send a lot of resources out. In those particular cases, when we get somebody into custody, the next thing we're looking for, is there a co-conspirator? Is there somebody else that may be causing some type of public safety concern? That's about as much as I can get into it, but I can tell you this is one of the top priorities for the FBI as far as civil rights. And we're actively engaged in it. The only other thing I'll add is after Pittsburgh Tree of Life, there was actually two major incidents that week. One was a shooting that occurred in Louisville where two African Americans were killed earlier that week. It didn't get a lot of press coverage after the Tree of Life. But subsequent to that, the FBI stood up what's called the Domestic Terrorism Hate Crimes Fusion Cell. It consists of experts across the FBI in the areas of domestic terrorism and hate crimes that sit in headquarters, and they assist all the field offices across the U.S. in preparing for some of these hate crime incidents.
Will, I want to ask you something that came up recently with somebody who was talking to us at Jewish News about a program they're working on in terms of volunteers, kind of who know what to look for, maybe better than the police, like what is really out of the ordinary at the synagogues, like synagogue members actually volunteering as kind of lookouts, or not lookouts, that's the criminal though, kind of looking out for problems. Is there any kind of legal problems that could raise, like people who are not carrying weapons, but who are out there kind of voluntarily posting themselves to look for troublemakers to avoid this kind of scenario?
Sure. And I might actually, after I give a brief response, kick it to Dan, because I know he actually works with a lot of houses of worship on questions about sort of what does operational security look like. Without purporting to be anyone's legal advisor as to what you can and can't do, I could say I think it's not uncommon for houses of worship across the religious spectrum to have people who are aware of what's going on in their congregations during and before services. And so I think it is something, again, I'll kick it to Dan trying to talk about specifics, but I think it is something that, being shy of the line of fear, but being aware of what's going on is something that can be very helpful in communities to feel more secure and to be more aware of what's going on.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Will. And I want to echo that point about being aware of what's going on, but not making concerns about what could happen your number one priority. The FBI has, like I said, done a study of active shooters over the past 20 years. And while there have been an alarming number of active shooters, there have been 13 that have targeted houses of worship. And some of those houses of worship, well, they're really only, they're loosely associated houses of worship. You have no idea how many houses of worship are in Arizona. We have a best guess at over 800 in Arizona. We have a best guess nationwide in the hundreds of thousands of houses of worship. All right, think about it. How much would we react were the federal government to mandate that new churches, new synagogues, new mosques report their establishment? So we don't have a good idea. We have a good idea. We don't have a exact number of how many houses of worship are around the nation. But if we're in the hundreds of thousands over 20 years, and 13 have been targeted by active shooters, this is something we need to be aware of. It's something we need to have a plan for, but it occurs on the same incidents as airplane crashes. You don't expect an airplane to crash. It doesn't hardly ever crash. When it does, though, you wish at that point you'd paid attention to the flight attendant talking about where the exits were and how to put on your oxygen mask, etc. And so it does fall to organizations, in this case, synagogues, churches, mosques, temples, to have a plan, but that plan shouldn't be the thing that they have foremost in their mind, shouldn't be the thing that they have the great concern about every week. Most security incidents at a house of worship have to do with estranged couples trying to determine custody issues when their kids have been dropped off by the other partner. The overwhelming number of security incidents have to do with the wrong parent showing up to get the kids, not an active shooter.
So can I ask you, is this almost like an overreaction that can be very counterproductive?
I think that a lot of things, Shannon, have to be measured and kept in balance, because we don't want to neglect the important problems that face us, but we can't let them dominate our lives. We can't live in fear because of something that happened elsewhere, could maybe happen. It's incumbent on us and those we're responsible for that we have a plan, that we weight it accordingly, and that we do our best every day to do the right thing for us, for those around us, for our community, for those we care about. And I would love it if we'd expand that circle every day a little bit, bring someone new in to that group of people we care about, people in our community. I think that would do a lot towards mitigating fear, not just in the Jewish community, but in all the communities in Arizona. And I know this is something that Paul feels strongly about, building connections between communities. That's one reason I value his partnership.
Yeah.
I'm actually sorry, Shannon. I'm going to jump in here because we're pretty much out of time. And truly, that was a wonderful statement and message to end this program on. We received many questions we couldn't get to. Sorry about that. But we have a lot of great ones left. And unfortunately, we promised everyone that this would only run a certain number of minutes. So I want to thank everyone involved with this from Miss McCabe, SSA Roberts, SA Johnson, and Mr. Voigt for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you to Shannon for doing a terrific job with these questions. Thank you to our viewers for watching our Q&A. And thank you again to our sponsors, the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Phoenix and the Jewish Federation of Greater Phoenix. Just a reminder, you can watch today's presentation on the Jewish News website, jewishaz.com. Just give us a couple of days, maybe the end of the week, to get that video edited and approved by the FBI, and then we'll get it posted on our homepage. But thank you again, everyone. I hope you all take care and have a terrific rest of your day.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You all.